I remember when I was in college watching a panel on civil rights, and one of the speakers was a feminist activist. It's been over 12 years since that day, so I don't remember much from the event, but I do remember one thing that the feminist activist said. She said that she wouldn't be satisfied until the day that a woman was standing on a platform at the U.S. Capitol getting sworn in as president by a woman who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That was her dream. I remember that the audience cheered when she said this. Her comment has always stuck with me. Ever since then, I've thought to myself, what would that moment be like? When would it happen? Who would it be? I also found myself asking, is that a fair way to measure progress or fairness or gender equality in our country? Does our country need to have a woman president and a woman chief justice? I think I understand why she said this. Firsts are a big deal. Everyone remembers the first person to do something. It's kind of like a way to mark time. When someone achieves something that hasn't been done before, it's seen as a milestone attained by society on the path to progress. We remember George Washington as the first president, or Neil Armstrong as the first man to walk on the moon. There's something about being first that resonates with our human spirit, our desire to achieve a goal or realize our highest ideals. Those who look forward to the day when we have our first woman president, I believe, are driven by an ideal, the ideal of equality regardless of gender. To them, it would be the fulfillment of a long struggle against centuries of sexism. For a woman to attain the highest office in the land, they believe, would show, if not the elimination of sexism, at least a big step towards achieving the promise of equality for all. Like most firsts, they believe that it would be a profound symbol of progress. In the past few months, I've asked several of my friends, both men and women, what they think about the prospect of a woman president. These included liberals and conservatives. As you can imagine, I got a wide range of responses. I heard men and women agree with the feminist activist I mentioned earlier, that sexism was rampant, and that they look forward to the day when there's a woman president. And I heard men and women say that the level of sexism in their society is negligible and that they could care less. And I heard arguments that were somewhere in between. And conservatives and liberals could be found in all three camps. We just lived through the first election in which a woman won the nomination of a major political party to be president of the United States, and came close to being elected. To many, this was a sign of major progress. In addition, there are more women today in American government than ever before. But one fact remains. Even though women have had the right to vote for almost a century, and that women consist of half of the country's population, no woman has ever served as president of the United States. But that doesn't mean that no woman has ever tried. In fact, many actually have. When Hillary Clinton announced her runs for the presidency in 2008 and 2016, many people discussed the topic of a woman president, what it could mean, how it would play out. But I noticed that few, including those who hoped for a woman president, knew much about the history of women running for president, or even knew their names. So I decided to investigate. Since 1872, there have been several dozen women who have run, almost all of them long shots, with little chance of winning. But that doesn't mean that they weren't important or interesting. And many of them achieved other firsts in American history. If so many people want a woman president, isn't it worth knowing the history of how we got to where we are today? This episode is not a comprehensive history of every woman candidate, but it will focus on those who made the biggest strides to put a woman in the White House. They were all strong-willed individuals who faced ridicule and resistance, and most of them, by virtue of their background, were unlikely figures in the annals of American history. Their stories and their dream to attain the nation's highest office are the subjects of this episode of This American President, the women who would be president. Part 1. Victoria Woodhull. In high school, I took AP US History, and my teacher was telling us about the suffrage movement, and it was the first time that I learned about the famous suffragists in American history, like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott. And I remember reading our textbook from the class and seeing the name Victoria Woodhull and a short blurb on how she was the first woman to run for president of the United States. But that was all it said. I didn't really think much about it at the time, but subconsciously I just lumped her in with the other suffragists, one of those elderly Victorian-era women with silver hair, fancy dresses, and big hats in those black and white pictures. And even though I've read a lot of history since then, I have to admit that I never really studied the American suffrage movement. And at some point afterwards, I remember looking up who was the first woman to run for US president in Google and seeing Woodhull's name again, but that's as far as my interest went. A little over 2 years ago, in April 2015, 3 days before Hillary Clinton announced her candidacy for president, Politico ran an article about Woodhull describing her as someone who blazed the trail for women candidates today. As I read about her, I realized that first, she was almost nothing like many of the other famous suffragists, and second, that very few people know about her. She is the answer to a trivia question, but most people don't even know she existed. But she is forever known to history as the first woman to ever run for the highest office in our country. The more I learned about her, the more I realized that our first female presidential candidate lived one of the most bizarre, inexplicable lives in our country's history. Victoria Woodhull was born Victoria California Claflin. Yes, California was her middle name. In 1838 in Homer, Ohio. She was the eighth of Reuben and Roxana Claflin's 10 children. Their family was dirt poor. Her father Reuben was basically a con man. He's often described as a swindler, a thief, or a snake oil salesman. He was someone always looking for a quick buck, and was not above any means to obtain it. Sometimes he pretended to be a doctor and sold his patients quack medicine, other times as a lawyer, giving his clients useless legal advice. Even worse, he shamelessly exploited his family in his quest for cash. 8 of his 10 kids were girls, and some sources indicated that he actually prostituted out some of his daughters. According to Victoria, it was not a happy childhood. In addition to being exploited, she later wrote that their father worked them to exhaustion and beat them with a handsaw. And she described her mother Roxy as being, quote,
never wholly sane, and the most erratic of mortals.
And if their upbringing wasn't unconventional enough, the Claflins were also practitioners of what has been described as spiritualism. So during this time and into the early 20th century, a lot of people in America were becoming interested in the paranormal. I'm not an expert on the subject, but it basically meant that a lot of people claimed to be clairvoyant, claimed to have some level of extrasensory perception, or that they could communicate with the dead. Historians have often linked the rise of spiritualism to the Second Great Awakening, the era's high infant mortality rate, or the Civil War. During and after the nation's bloodiest war, grief-stricken Americans reached out to mediums in the hope that they could commune with their fallen relatives. And this wasn't limited to the average person. Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, attended seances, and the president himself reportedly joined her during at least one session. And many members of the Claflin family considered themselves spiritualists who were gifted with special powers. During spiritual sessions, their mother Roxy apparently would become entranced while frothing at the mouth. And like her mother, apparently Victoria believed herself to be clairvoyant. She claimed to have communed throughout her life with Napoleon and the ancient orator Demosthenes. She also claimed that at the age of 10, she encountered angels
who told me I was to be in their charge, and they were to constantly guide, instruct, and care for me, so that I should be, when grown, fitted to do their work on earth.
She said one angel told her she would
rise to a great distinction, and that she would become the ruler of her people.
So this was the unorthodox environment which produced our country's first woman candidate for president. True to form, her father Reuben exploited her supposed clairvoyance and peddled her as a child preacher, and apparently Victoria made the most of it. She spellbound audiences with sermons and trances. From this experience, her biographers believe she gained the oratory skills she used throughout her career. She certainly didn't get it from her school, since her education was practically non-existent. Things didn't get better for Victoria when she grew up. When she was 15, her parents married her off to Canning Woodhull, a doctor who was almost twice her age. Unfortunately, he was also an alcoholic and a constant patron of local brothels. They had 2 kids, Byron and Zula, but sadly, Byron had a severe mental disability. Victoria described raising him as a daily agony. She had a miserable family life. Victoria dabbled in random jobs. For a time, she was a seamstress and then an actress, and she continued profiting off her claimed psychic powers. At a certain point, she tired of Canning's infidelity and alcoholism and filed for divorce. But before it was finalized, she met a Civil War veteran named James Harvey Blood, who happened to be the president of the Spiritualist Society. Apparently, when they met, Victoria fell into a trance and declared that they would be married. According to her official biographer, Theodore Tilton, quote, "To their mutual amazement, but to their subsequent happiness, they were betrothed on the spot by the powers of the air." Tilton described Blood as, quote, "a radical of extreme radicalism, an internationalist of the most uncompromising type, a communist who would rather have died in Paris than be the president of a pretended republic." And from her new husband, Victoria derived many of her unconventional political beliefs, and one of those beliefs was something called free love. Apparently, this term potentially has many meanings. A more conservative interpretation was support for divorce reform, which sought to remedy the highly unfavorable consequences divorce had on the legal status of women at the time. Another was the idea that individuals had the right to have regular sexual relations with anyone, even if they were married. Of course, adultery was nothing new, but many felt that it was unfair that women carried more of a stigma when they engaged in adultery than men. Therefore, by making fornication acceptable, they were removing the stigma for women. Although she would forever be associated with free love ideas, Victoria did have enough social awareness to know that these positions were too radical to be widely accepted during her lifetime. By the way, you'll notice that she kept her first husband's last name Woodhull rather than take her second husband's last name. So she never ended up being named Victoria Blood, which I personally think would have added to her street cred among fellow spiritualists. So when Victoria was 29, she and Colonel Blood moved to New York City and took not only her 2 children, but the whole Claflin clan with them, including her sister Tennessee Claflin, who was 7 years her junior, her parents, and her first husband, Canning, since he was utterly dependent on her. So that must have been a fun household. She and her sister Tennessee grew quite close at this time. They were like kindred spirits. And it was at this time that they made a decision that would change the rest of their lives. Up until now, they spent most of their lives living off fortune-telling and other odd jobs to avoid poverty. It wasn't exactly what one would describe as a stable existence. But they both knew that many of the upper class of New York, like them, were into spiritualism. So they set out on an ambitious plan to target one person in particular, one person with wealth and influence, a fellow spiritualist who could become their benefactor and forever pluck them out of poverty and obscurity. That person was Cornelius Vanderbilt. Yes, the Cornelius Vanderbilt, the famous railroad and shipping tycoon. Now, I previously did an episode that took place in the Gilded Age, our 3rd episode, Fake News and Nasty Men, and it covered the astonishing amount of wealth amassed in that era. Well, Cornelius Vanderbilt was one of the most colorful figures of a very colorful time. Like the Claflin sisters, Vanderbilt was born into poverty and had little education. He rose to become insanely rich, turning a business with a single boat into a shipping and railroad empire. Like the Rockefellers and Carnegies of his day, Vanderbilt was worth somewhere in the range of $100 to $200 billion in today's dollars. To give you a point of reference, Bill Gates is currently worth about $90 billion. By the time the Claflin sisters set their sights on him, Vanderbilt was in his 70s and had recently lost his wife of almost 55 years. So you can imagine that he was susceptible to these 2 attractive 20-something-year-old women with reputations for telepathic powers. Apparently, Vanderbilt would sometimes personally greet visitors at his mansion, so that gave the 2 sisters the opportunity to literally show up on his doorstep sometime in 1868. Vanderbilt's biographies make just passing mention of their relationship, and it's not really clear what all happened. Tennessee was known as an incorrigible flirt, and some sources say that she and Vanderbilt were very cozy together. Beyond that, who knows? At any rate, less than 2 years later, February 5th, 1870, the two Claflin sisters, raised in poverty and with no legitimate business experience, had acquired enough cash to open up a brokerage firm in New York City. Two women whose expertise was in crystal balls and seances were now the first women in American history to own a brokerage firm. It was named Woodhull, Claflin and Company, and it was believed that it was built off of Vanderbilt's money. Now, we live in a world where there are women CEOs and heads of state, so you have to remember how this struck the people in the 1870s. At the time, business and politics were seen as the man's domain, while the home belonged to the woman. Historians have described the role of women in society as, quote, the cult of domesticity, the idea being that women in the Victorian world, of course specifically women in the Western world, were primarily confined to the home, but it went deeper than that. They were also seen as being morally superior to men. According to these historians, women were marked by the four cardinal virtues: piety, purity, submission, and domesticity. Now, I know that the cult of domesticity sounds like some esoteric academic term, but the interesting concept I want to focus on is the idea of the female's moral superiority. Men had a leading role in business and politics and were considered morally inferior. I guess with all the corruption going on, especially in the Gilded Age, I can see why people might see it this way. Whatever one thinks of this, it helps us understand why, at the time, many people, including women, opposed the suffrage movement and the idea of women working outside the home. For a woman to be engaged in a man's world was seen not only as improper, but also exposing women to the immorality of the man's world, disrupting the natural order of things. But it was also an era of profound social and political reform. The country was industrializing, changing the economy and opening up new opportunities for both men and women. It was also confronting the implications of its original promise that all men are created equal. Slavery had been abolished by the 13th Amendment just 5 years earlier, and the women's suffrage movement was in full swing ever since the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which declared that all men and women were created equal. Attitudes about women and their role in society were changing, so many did welcome the Claflin sisters into the business world. When word spread of their firm, the sisters made the most of it, charming journalists and touting themselves as friends of Vanderbilt. Soon they were celebrities. Throughout all of this, however, the sisters concealed their difficult past. When interviewed about their upbringing, the sisters described an idyllic childhood and loving, hardworking, and reputable parents. The suffrage leaders of the time loved them. After meeting them, Susan B. Anthony publicly wrote the sisters were, quote, determined to use their brains, their energy, and their knowledge of business to earn a livelihood. Their presence on Wall Street marks a new era. The sisters were now hobnobbing with the New York City elite, industrialists, financiers, politicians, suffragists, and radicals. It's funny to think, here were two women entering the world of hyper-capitalism. All the while, Victoria's husband was an avowed communist. The sisters got their share of positive and negative press. Of their firm, the New York Herald wrote, quote, "We like the experiment as a new thing, and we wish it success." The firm opened in February 1870. Less than 2 months later, on April 2nd, 1870, Woodhull would do something that no other woman had ever done and would forever put her in the history books as accomplishing a first in American history. She announced that she was a candidate for President of the United States. Ever since the rise of political parties, viable presidential candidates usually seek the nomination of an established party. True to form, Woodhull dispensed with politics as usual and took her case straight to the people. Her announcement appeared in the sympathetic New York Herald. Embracing the feminist cause, she declared, quote,
I happen to be the most prominent representative of the only unrepresented class in the Republic, and perhaps the most practical exponent of the principles of equality.
But she drew the line between herself and the feminists of her day. Whereas the suffragist efforts rested mainly on persuading the American voters, pretty much all of whom were male, to change the voting laws, Woodhull instead argued that women had to make their hopes a reality. Quote,
While others of my sex devote themselves to a crusade against the laws that shackle the women of this country, I asserted my individual independence. While others prayed for the good time coming, I worked for it. While others argued that the equality of woman with man, I proved it by successfully engaging in business. While others sought to show that there was no valid reason why women should be treated socially and politically as being inferior to man, I boldly entered the arena of politics and business and exercised the rights I already possessed. I therefore claim the right to speak for the unenfranchised women of the country, believing as I do that there will be more female office holders than female voters for some time to come, and that the prejudices that exist in the popular mind against women in public life will soon disappear, I announce myself as candidate for the presidency.
With all of the social changes going on, Woodhull and the suffragists believed that this was the time to push for women's participation in public life and to make it a reality themselves. And Woodhull envisioned herself leading that movement. She said, quote,
Lincoln's election showed the strength of the feeling against the peculiar institution. My candidacy for the presidency will, I confidently expect, develop the fact that the principles of equal rights for all have taken deep root.
During her campaign, she crusaded against both the Democrats and the Republicans, but specifically targeted the administration of President Ulysses S. Grant, which was mired in scandal after scandal. She pushed for pro-labor and pro-reform policies, like increased aid to the poor and prison reforms, and she also advocated reducing the national debt. As one can imagine, many newspapers ridiculed her run, but some supported it. The always friendly Herald stated that, if women had the right to vote, she may actually win, and touted her as, quote, a smart and handsome woman, the proper person to stand forth against the field as the women's rights candidate for the White House. 6 weeks after her announcement, the sisters released their own paper, named Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, which they funded themselves. Assisting them in the paper was Colonel Blood, Woodhull's pro-communist husband, and another radical named Stephen Pearl Andrews, who was a utopian philosopher, a radical labor activist, a student of Marx, and supporter of world government and women's rights. Unfortunately for the sisters, Andrews would quickly prove to be a problem. Woodhull knew that certain radical views would be too much for the public, but Andrews did not have that same tact. In the fall of 1870, he wrote an article in the Weekly where he attacked the institution of marriage, saying that women who were trapped in a situation of dependence on their husbands were basically relegated to prostitution. Despite the ongoing social reform, this was too much for Victorian-era America. The Idaho Statesman said that the Weekly had, quote, fallen prey to evil counsels, and we fear has been seduced from original good purposes by designing men. With that said, Woodhull, once an exploited child of a poor family, still continued her ascent as a leader among American women. She touted an argument for women's suffrage that departed from many others in the movement. During this time, the suffragists were pushing for what they hoped would become the 16th Amendment, which would guarantee the right to vote for women, which ultimately became the 19th Amendment. But Woodhull countered that the Constitution already provided for women's political equality with man, since Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution said, quote, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. And since the Wyoming Territory had already given women the right to vote in 1869, she claimed that women throughout the country already had that same right. And she argued that the 14th and 15th Amendments, which guaranteed citizenship and voting rights to African Americans, applied to women as well. On January 11, 1871, Victoria Woodhull made history again. With the help of Congressman Benjamin Wade, a radical Republican supportive of women's rights, she presented a petition, known to history as the Woodhull Memorial, to the House Judiciary Committee. In doing so, she became the first woman to address a committee of Congress. Although the petition was rejected, suffragists were enthralled by Woodhull's audacity. The New York Tribune wrote, quote, Mrs. Woodhull has at last risen to her rightful place as the legitimate leader of the women's suffrage movement in its formal demand made yesterday upon Congress for recognition. That same day she addressed a convention of suffragists, again impressing Stanton and Anthony, and convinced them to drop the 16th Amendment in favor of her approach. Her presentation to the committee and her subsequent speech showcased her oratory skills, honed during her years as a child preacher. She was now in heavy demand across the nation, and touring the country giving lectures for her presidential candidacy and for women's suffrage. She expanded her base of support by strengthening her ties to labor. In the spring of 1871, she announced her support for the American Labor Reform League, ironic considering she was a very rich Wall Street broker who hobnobbed with the wealthy in New York. Soon she went global. She became a member of the International Working Men's Association, IWA, also known as the First International, a federation of radical labor activists. As Woodhull's star rose, for many she represented a revolutionizing force in the future of women in America. But events conspired to destroy much of the goodwill she initially enjoyed. Trouble was brewing for her. More papers began to make light for her newspaper colleague Andrew's support for free love. Some were calling Woodhull the free love candidate, even though she denied it. They argued that supporting free love was the equivalent of supporting promiscuity and even prostitution. And her family background, in which her father exploited his daughters to that effect, exposed her to charges of being a harlot. Indeed, it was her family, the Claflin clan, who would end up being her downfall. In May 1871, Woodhull's mother, Roxy, dropped a bombshell when she publicly accused Victoria's husband, Colonel Blood, of attempting to murder her, as well as of committing fraud and blackmail. In the trial that ensued, it came out that Woodhull was living with both her current husband, Colonel Blood, and her first husband, Canning. Further details came out about their whole family, including all the other deadbeat siblings living off the two famous sisters, and their dad's disreputable profession. This contradicted their earlier claims of having a reputable background. The entire episode ruined their public image. Both men and women, including suffragists, turned on the sisters, whether it was for their free love views or for their family scandals. One paper wrote, quote, "The startling revelations just made in New York concerning the marital or supramarital relations of Mrs. Victoria Woodhull, the female broker, female suffrage advocate, and self-nominated female candidate for the presidency, will, we fear, be fatal to her presidential aspirations, if not to her brokerage business and her influence as an advocate of women's rights." Woodhull, however, remained undaunted. She argued that her living with Canning was an act of charity, as he was too drunk to function on his own. She maintained that her mother was completely insane, and now she openly embraced the most radical free love views, saying that most men preach against free love but practice it openly, arguing that male promiscuity was more prevalent than acknowledged. She argued, quote,
"Marriage is a fraud upon human happiness. In forced sexual relations, where there is neither attraction or sexual adaptation, it is the common experience among the married who have lived together strictly according to the marriage covenant, for from 5 to 10 years, that they are sexually estranged."
Later, she said, quote,
"Those who are called prostitutes are free women sexually when compared to married women."
In November 1871, she declared in a speech, quote,
"Yes, I am a free lover. I have an inalienable, constitutional, and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or as short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please, and with that right neither you, nor any law you can frame, have any right to interfere."
Some suffragists, including Elizabeth Stanton, remained loyal to the sisters. Stanton joined Woodhull and called out what she considered male hypocrisy, but also attacked women for allowing themselves to become tools of their male opponents. Stanton wrote Woodhull, quote, "We have had women enough sacrificed to this sentimental, hypocritical prating about purity. This is one of man's most effective engines for our division and subjugation. He creates the public sentiment, builds the gallows, and then makes us hangmen for our sex. We are ever cruel to each other." The sisters' weekly paper became more and more radical, printing the first English copy of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto in 1871. At its peak, The paper had a national circulation of 20,000, and the sisters would use it to fight back against their enemies. One enemy in particular was Henry Ward Beecher, the famous abolitionist, social reformer, and Congregationalist preacher. Like Woodhull, he too was known for his mesmerizing oratory, but he was one of Woodhull's harshest critics and condemned her free love views in the strongest terms. Ironically, this preacher was also known to be a serial womanizer, the exact type of person Woodhull attacked for hypocrisy. The sisters set their sights on Reverend Beecher. Meanwhile, a group of pro-Woodhull suffragists and radicals gathered together in May 1872 under the name of the Equal Rights Party and nominated Woodhull for president. They also nominated abolitionist Frederick Douglass for the vice presidency, even though he never participated or endorsed the party. He would never acknowledge his nomination, and, being far more of a political realist, actually supported incumbent President Ulysses S. Grant that year. Another wrinkle to her presidential aspirations was that Woodhull wasn't even eligible for the presidency, as she wouldn't have been 35 by Inauguration Day. But no matter, Woodhull was the first woman in American history to run for president, and she could now point to a party that had nominated her. And adding Douglas's name to the ticket gave it a sense of legitimacy in the history books. At any rate, on November 2, 1872, 3 days before the election, the Weekly published an account of Reverend Beecher's adultery. In doing so, the sisters argued that it was further proof that marriage was obsolete and pointed out the hypocrisy of those who attacked her, specifically those in the clergy. The issue sold like hotcakes, but in circulating the issue, the sisters were soon charged with obscenity and were arrested. Yes, you could get arrested for that in 1872. Circulating an article about an affair in Victorian-era America qualified as obscenity back then. So history records that the first woman candidate for president was actually in prison on Election Day. There is a funny story of how Woodhull dressed in a Quaker costume, trying to elude capture. She wrote,
I soon presented the appearance of an old decrepit Quaker lady. In this costume, I confidently entered the hall, passing half a dozen or more United States Marshals, who stood guarding the entrances and warning the people that there was to be no lecture there that night. So certain they were of arresting me. But I passed them all safely, one of them even essaying to assist me on the way through the crowd.
The sisters ended up being acquitted, but it was an exhausting ordeal that played out salaciously in public. Ulysses Grant ended up winning in a landslide in 1872. Woodhull didn't get a single electoral vote, and an unknown but negligible percentage of the popular vote. The suffragists, including Stanton, this time abandoned the sister in droves. As the public soured on them, their paper and brokerage began to fail. Vanderbilt wanted nothing to do with them. That same year, a famous political cartoon by Thomas Nast was published in Harper's Weekly, depicting Woodhull as Mrs. Satan, holding up a sign that says, quote, "Be saved by free love." It captured what many people, both men and women, thought of Woodhull. Now the Beecher scandal ended up becoming a trial and a public spectacle of its own. Back then, you could sue someone for, quote, alienating your wife's affection. Theodore Tilton, whose wife had been accused of engaging in an affair with Beecher, sued him for just that. That trial began in January 1875 and became one of the most infamous sex scandals of the 19th century. After 6 months, the jury was unable to reach a verdict, and Beecher was, in effect, exonerated. But the proceedings added further infamy to the sisters, as both the prosecution and defense attacked them both as loose women. Woodhull attempted to run for president again in 1884 and 1892, declaring that she was, quote, destined by prophecy to be elected president. After the circus of those years, Woodhull faded from public view. Eventually, she divorced Colonel Blood and moved with her sister Tennessee to England, where they both married fantastically wealthy men and lived very comfortable lives. Biographers often note, again, the irony of these women, sympathetic to socialist pro-labor movements, but living lives of luxurious splendor. As time passed, the vitriol they incurred began to die down. Eventually in England, they became elder socialites, even respected by the new generation as part of the early suffrage movement. While they lived out the rest of their lives in comfort, They had the emotional scars of their turbulent younger years, their difficult upbringing, the public exposure of their family secrets, the sensational scandals, and the hatred they received for their political stances. Much of this, one could argue, was self-inflicted, but they took a toll nonetheless. Woodhull would tell her fellow suffragist Lucretia Mott, quote,
"All that I am, I have become through sorrow."
Tennessee Claflin died at the age of 77 on September 4th, 1919. Victoria Woodhull died at the age of 88 on June 9th, 1927. Part 2. Margaret Chase Smith. While Woodhull was the first woman to run for the American presidency, she was quite unconventional, with views outside the mainstream. The next figure we will discuss, who ran for the White House 92 years after Woodhull's campaign, was very different. And by then, things in America had changed profoundly. Women could vote, and many women had served in elective politics. Margaret Chase Smith was born Margaret Chase on December 14, 1897, in Skowhegan, Maine, to a family of modest means. She was the oldest of 6 kids. Her father was a barber, and her mother was a waitress, a store clerk, and a factory worker. To support her family, Margaret, too, would waitress and work as a store clerk. In high school, she got a part-time job as a telephone operator. Around this time, she met her future husband, Clyde Smith, who was a prominent local businessman and politician. He was also 40 years old, more than twice her age, and divorced. They began a long relationship for more than a decade that finally ended up in marriage in 1930, when she was 32 and he was 53. Unfortunately, like Canning Woodhull, he was also quite the philanderer. Throughout this time, Margaret, now Margaret Chase Smith, wrote for a newspaper and was active in women's clubs. Prior to suffrage, these clubs were among the few outlets where women could play a role in public service and politics. She was also elected to the Republican Party State Committee. In 1936, Clyde was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Margaret moved with him to D.C. and worked in his office as a secretary. Clyde was a progressive supporter of the New Deal. Unfortunately, he was also sick with heart issues and a sexually transmitted disease. Eventually, Margaret took over more and more of his duties, meeting with constituents and speaking on his behalf. While Clyde was an isolationist in the run-up to World War I, Margaret advocated for increased defense spending and military preparedness, and attacked British policies of appeasement of Hitler. Of course, it didn't hurt that Maine had a big stake in defense spending. Although she was a Republican, her anti-isolationist views aligned more with the incumbent Democrat President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In April 1940, Clyde Smith died. But just before he passed away, he endorsed his wife as his replacement. Whenever this happened, it was known as the widow's mandate. The first time this occurred was in 1923, when Republican May Nolan took over her late husband's congressional seat. But the idea was that the widow would serve as a placeholder in their late husband's seat until the party chose a male successor. Headlines declared, quote, "Mrs. Smith goes to Washington." Much of the media coverage about her was favorable. The Christian Science Monitor wrote that Smith was, quote, "well established in her own right as a candidate for public office." 2 months into office, she faced a competitive primary with 4 male Republicans, but she easily defeated them all and sailed to an easy win in the general election. She became the first woman elected to Congress from Maine. There were 8 women serving in the House at the time, but Smith stood out among them and those who previously served because of her support for internationalist and pro-defense policies. Many female representatives were either pacifists or, like most Americans after World War I, non-interventionist. But Smith continued to support FDR's war mobilization plans and his repeal of the 1939 Neutrality Act. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Smith appeared quite prophetic for supporting defense preparations. She became an expert on defense issues, getting an assignment on the Naval Affairs Committee, now the Armed Services Committee, and she would be reelected to the House twice, showing that women in the House were no longer just placeholders. She identified with the moderate international wing of the Republican Party, closer to people like Thomas Dewey and Dwight Eisenhower than conservatives Bob Taft and Barry Goldwater. She bucked conservatives of her party by supporting government housing, childcare, healthcare, and wage equality. But she also supported the Taft-Hartley Act, which curbed the power of unions. She didn't closely identify with feminists, although she did vote in favor of the perpetually proposed Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. She argued that the label feminist implied she cared more about women instead of all people. In 1948, she was the first woman elected to the U.S. Senate without being appointed or winning a special election, and was the first woman to serve in both houses of Congress. When asked whether a woman would serve well in the Senate, she replied, quote,
"Women administer the home. They set the rules, enforce them, mete out justice for violations. Thus, like Congress, they legislate. Like the executive, they administer. Like the courts, they interpret the rules. It is an ideal experience for politics."
Her victory made her the only woman senator then serving. It also made her a national figure. The Boston Globe mused that, quote, Margaret Smith could be president. Upon taking office, Smith said, quote,
"I was elected in spite of the fact that I am a woman, and that in itself was a victory for all women, for it smashed the unwritten tradition that the Senate is no place for a woman. Women do not blindly support some candidates just because they are women. We are not headed for an Amazonian world. No one should be barred from public office just because she is a woman."
She hoped her win was part of a
growing realization that ability and proved performance, rather than sex, are the best standards for political selection, just as much as they are for any other kind of selection. I like to think I am a symbol of this.
She would go on to serve 4 terms in the Senate, that's 24 years, against the backdrop of post-World War II recovery and the Cold War. Throughout those years, she stuck true to her pro-military ways, supporting a tough anti-Soviet policy, an increase in the country's nuclear stockpile, and even advocated for their use against North Korea and China during the Korean War. No one needed to question her toughness. Her big moment in the Senate, however, came during the Red Scare. Joe McCarthy, a fellow Republican senator, began his anti-communist crusade, using tactics that alienated Americans across the country. Smith was distressed at his tactics and what it meant for her party, and, more importantly, her country. On June 1st, 1950, with McCarthy sitting a couple of rows behind her, Smith rose to deliver what has been called her Declaration of Conscience, where she condemned McCarthy. She began saying, quote,
"I speak as a Republican. I speak as a woman. I speak as a United States Senator. I speak as an American."
She affirmed that the communist threat to the American homeland was real, and that dangerous government secrets had been leaked to the Soviets. She then affirmed the basic principles of Americanism.
The right to criticize. The right to hold unpopular beliefs. The right to protest. The right of independent thought.
She then added, quote,
"Those of us who shout the loudest about Americanism in making character assassinations are all too frequently those who, by our own words and acts, ignore some of the basic principles of Americanism. The exercise of these rights should not cost one single American citizen his reputation or his right to a livelihood, nor should he be in danger of losing his reputation or livelihood merely because he happens to know someone who holds unpopular beliefs. Who of us doesn't? Otherwise, none of us could call our souls our own. Otherwise, thought control would have set in. The American people are sick and tired of being afraid to speak their minds, lest they be politically smeared as communists or fascists by their opponents. Freedom of speech is not what it used to be in America. It has been so abused by some that it is not exercised by others. The American people are sick and tired of seeing innocent people smeared and guilty people whitewashed. I don't want to see the Republican Party ride to political victory on the 4 horsemen of calumny: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear. I doubt if the Republican Party could. simply because I don't believe the American people will uphold any political party that puts political exploitation above national interest. Surely we Republicans aren't that desperate for victory. I don't want to see the Republican Party win that way. While it might be a fleeting victory for the Republican Party, it would be a more lasting defeat for the American people. Surely it would ultimately be suicide for the Republican Party and the two-party system that has protected our American liberties from the dictatorship of a one-party system. As an American, I condemn a Republican fascist just as much as I condemn a Democratic communist. I condemn a Democratic fascist just as much as I condemn a Republican communist. They are equally dangerous to you and me and to our country. As an American, I want to see our nation recapture the strength and unity it once had when we fought the enemy instead of ourselves.
It was the speech of her career and was hailed across the country as an act of political heroism. It also contributed to the tide that turned against McCarthy, leading to his ultimate censure. After her declaration on the Senate floor, Gallup polls showed Smith among the most admired women in the world. She was also being discussed as a possible presidential or vice presidential candidate. But with Dwight Eisenhower as the Republican nominee in 1952 and 1956, and Richard Nixon as the nominee in 1960, Smith really never had a chance to make headway, so she continued to serve in the Senate. By the early 1960s, views on women were changing. There was a nascent women's movement, and in 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act, and Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique. Polls were indicating that about 55% of Americans could accept a woman president, up from one-third in the 1940s. President Kennedy, who served with her in the Senate, was asked about her potential candidacy in 1964.
As a possible candidate for president, would you comment on the possible candidacy of Margaret Chase Smith and specifically what effect that would have on the New Hampshire primary?
I would think, if I were a Republican candidate, I would not look forward to campaigning against Margaret Chase Smith in New Hampshire. Or as a possible candidate for president, I think she's very formidable, if that's the appropriate word to use about a very fine lady. She's a very formidable political figure.
Getting back to Professor Barthorn for a moment.
Smith kept to her hawkish ways. In fact, during Kennedy's presidency, Smith argued that the United States should use nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. This provoked the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to call her, quote, the devil in disguise of a woman who exceeded all records of savagery. She responded, quote,
Mr. Khrushchev isn't really mad at me. I am not that important. He is angry because American officials have grown more firm since my speech.
Her long political career and the admiration she had earned made Smith the first viable woman candidate for president. By then, however, she was 65 years old, a fact that many felt disqualified her. Ironically, some polls indicated that women, more than men, feared that she didn't have the stamina for the nation's highest office in an era of nuclear crises. Undaunted, she prepared for a run for the Republican nomination in 1964. The party was split between the moderates, led by New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and the conservatives, led by Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Rockefeller, however, was tarred by his recent divorce. There was talk of a Goldwater-Smith ticket, although Smith flatly denied she was running for the presidency to obtain the vice presidency. JFK's assassination in late 1963 put Lyndon Johnson in the White House and shook up the 1964 race. In tribute to her former colleague, Smith left a rose on the desk Kennedy used in the Senate. President Johnson ran for a term in his own right, largely on the basis of continuing Kennedy's policies, putting the Republicans in the awkward position of opposing a beloved assassinated president's program. Smith suspended all speaking engagements for the rest of 1963. But on January 27, 1964, at the National Press Club, she announced her candidacy for the presidency. In her speech, she pointed out that she had far more experience than her male opponents, having been in the Congress since 1940. she announced that she would run without purchasing airtime on the radio or television for advertisements, and that she would enter the New Hampshire and Illinois primary to test her viability. She promised not to campaign when Congress was in session.
I have decided that I shall enter the New Hampshire presidential preferential primary and the Illinois primary. For I accept the reasons advanced against my running as challenges which I met before in 1948, when I first ran for United States Senator from Maine, when I did not have the money that my opponents did, when I did not have the professional party organization that my opponents did, when it was said that the Senate is no place for a woman, when my physical strength was sapped during the campaign with a broken arm, when my conservative opponent and my liberal opponent in Maine were not restricted in campaigning by official duties in Washington, such as I had, and when practically no one gave me a chance to win. My candidacy in the New Hampshire primary will be a test in several ways. It will be a test of how much support will be given a candidate without campaign funds. It will be a test of how much support will be given a candidate without a professional party organization of paid campaign workers, but instead composed of non-paid amateur volunteers. It will be a test of how much support will be given a candidate who refuses to absent herself from the official duties to which she has been elected, and whose campaign time in New Hampshire will be limited to those times when the Senate is not in session, voting on legislation. It will be a test of how much support will be given to a candidate who will not purchase political time on television or radio or political advertisements and publications. It will be a test of how much support will be given a candidate who will campaign on a record rather than on promises. I welcome the challenges, and I look forward to the test.
Many in the media believed her qualified for the presidency and expressed admiration for her, but continued to bring up her age. The Los Angeles Times wrote, quote, "Mrs. Smith has the qualifications and experience for the presidency no less than many men who have served in the office." The Times continued, saying that age, quote, "tends to be a disqualifying factor," and that at Smith's age, quote, "the female of the species undergoes physical changes and emotional distress of varying severity and duration, known to have an effect on judgment and behavior." Smith complained about the media's focus on her age and responded that women live longer than men and that many male world leaders were older than her. In fact, President Eisenhower had left office less than 4 years earlier at the age of 70, but memories of his heart attacks were enough to cause the American people to be wary of possible health issues in their elected leaders. Age notwithstanding, Smith faced other big hurdles. Historian Ellen Fitzpatrick writes, "The campaign had no press bus, no advance team, no headquarters, no chartered planes, and no rallies. She campaigned the old-fashioned way, trudging through the snows of New Hampshire, meeting voters one-on-one. Since she promised to stay in Congress when it was in session, she could only campaign for 2 weeks before the primaries. She had to perform well, considering New Hampshire neighbored her home state. Unfortunately for her, on Election Day, she barely made a dent, winning less than 3,000 votes, or just over 2%. Henry Cabot Lodge won the primary with 36%, while Goldwater and Rockefeller were next in the low 20s. While Smith did well in Illinois, finishing second with 25% of the vote, she didn't clear 4% in any subsequent primaries. Barry Goldwater would go on to win the nomination at the convention in July in San Francisco. But Smith was in attendance and made history there as the first woman to have her name placed in the nomination for the presidency by a major political party. Smith remained in the Senate after her presidential bid, supporting the Vietnam War, civil rights legislation, and funding for the space program. But in 1972, she was defeated in a re-election bid, in part because of rumors of poor health. Upon retiring from the Senate, she held the all-time voting record with 2,941 consecutive roll call votes, and was the longest-serving woman senator in American history, both of which have now been surpassed. Still to this day, she remains the longest-serving Republican woman in Senate history.